Let us begin by enlivening our hearts and minds and our gathering with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Who or what is God? How do we understand God? And how ought our relationship to God be? If someone were to ask you this question, describe for me God. Who is God? What are the attributes of God? How are we as humans to perceive of God and our relationship to God? Now, this is a question that many of you have probably thought about yourself. And it is likely that humans, as long as they have existed, they have also thought about this question. And many have tried to provide various answers. We find theologians and philosophers and many others across the course of history who have navigated these questions. And they've deliberated and they've argued and they've gone back and forth trying to paint for humanity a description of God and our relationship to God. Tonight, I want us to turn to the teachings of Imam Ali alayhi salam in order to examine some of his teachings in Nahj al-Balagha regarding God and who God is. For Imam Ali was the masterful theologian. He is known as Mawla al-Muwahhideen, the master of the monotheists. And we find in his teachings both a profound sense of theoretical knowledge and in his life and legacy, practical application in understanding, recognizing God, and connecting with God, worshiping and devoting himself to God. Imam Ali is, as I mentioned, Mawla al-Muwahhideen. He is one who was gifted, endowed with a profound understanding and recognition of God. In a famous hadith, the Prophet, he is speaking to Imam Ali. And he says to him, Ya Ali, ma arafa Allahu illa ana wa ant. Wa ma arafani illa Allah wa ant. Wa ma arafaka illa Allah wa ana. He says, Oh Ali, no one has truly understood God except you and me. And no one has understood me truly except God and you. And no one has understood you, O Ali, truly except God and me. Imam Ali was profound in his understanding and his recognition of God. And we find in his teachings a profound description, an impeccable description, how he teaches us to conceive of God and to understand God. In sermon number 64 or 65, there are variations in some of the editions, but it's either 64 or 65. We find that Imam Ali alayhi salam presents us with a very beautiful description of God, very profound. I want to relate some parts of it to you. He praises God. He says, الحمد لله الذي لم تسبق له حال حالا فيكون أولا قبل أن يكون آخرا. Praise is due to God for whom one condition does not precede another, so that he may be the first before being the last, or that he may be manifest before being hidden. What does this mean? You and I, our conditions are successive. If I were to say that I was the first person here, that means that I cannot be the last person here. That means that others came after me. If I was the last person here, that means that I cannot be the first person here. That means that others came before me. If I am appearing here, I cannot be in Los Angeles. I'm hidden in Los Angeles, at least physically. Whereas with God, these conditions are not successive. This is why we can say, هُوَ الْأَوَّلُ وَالْآخِرُ وَالظَّاهِرُ وَالْبَاطِنُ. We say God is the first and the last. God is the manifest and the hidden. Because God's conditions are not successive like human conditions or the conditions of God's creation. So Imam Ali says, praise be to God. This is the first description. Praise be to God for whom one condition does not precede another condition, so that he may be first before being last, or he may be manifest before being hidden. Then he says, كُلُّ مُسَمًّى بِالْوَحْدَةِ غَيْرَهُ قَلِيلٌ. Everyone who is identified as being one besides God is small in number. The number one is the smallest number. Smallest number, right? When we say there is one person here, it means there's a little amount of people here. Right? Whereas God is the only being who, when we identify as being one, this has no connotation of littleness. Small number. كل مسمى بالوحدة غيره قليل becomes insignificant. If you are one, you are lonely. There's an insignificance to that. Whereas with God, that oneness is a source of greatness. Right? Then he says, وَكُلُّ عَزِيزٍ غَيْرَهُ ذَلِيلٌ. And everyone besides him who is labeled honorable is in fact subservient. In fact, subservient. Is in fact humble. No matter how honorable you are. No matter what kind of title you have in society. No matter what kind of resume or CV you have, in the end, in relation to God, you are humble. So God is the only source of true honor. He says, وَكُلُّ قَوِيٍّ غَيْرَهُ ضَعِيفٌ. And everyone besides God who is identified as being strong is in fact weak. Spend your entire life bodybuilding. Right? Be the strongest man or woman out there. But in the end, in reality, we are weak. A small virus that cannot be seen by the eye destroys even the most powerful and even the most physically strong. So everyone besides God who is described as powerful is in fact, in reality, is weak. وَكُلُّ مَالِكٍ غَيْرَهُ مَمْلُوكٍ. And everyone besides him who is an owner, a master, is in fact a slave who is him or herself owned by God. You can own as much land as you want, as much property, as much money, wealth. You can have armies, you can have resources, but in the end, each and every one of us is a slave to God. We are owned by God. And then he says, وَكُلُّ عَالِمٍ غَيْرَهُ مُتَعَلِّمٍ. And everyone besides God who is labeled as knowledgeable is in fact still a seeker of knowledge. Go out and read all of the books you want. Collect all of the degrees that you can. Memorize everything that you can. But in reality, you are still a seeker of knowledge. And by the way, this is the ultimate objective of seeking knowledge, is to make us humble. Those who learn, the more you learn, they realize how little you know. So Imam says everyone besides God who is identified as knowledgeable is in fact still learning. It is only God who has absolute knowledge. وَكُلُّ قَادِرٍ غَيْرَهُ يَقْدِرُ وَيَعْجِزُ. And he says, and everyone besides God who is identified as having control other than him is sometimes imbued with control and sometimes with disability. Sometimes you have control, you are able, and sometimes you are unable. And then he continues. He says a few sentences down. He says, لم يخلق ما خلقه لتشديد سلطان ولا تخوف من عواقب زمان ولا استعانة على ند مثار ولا شريك مكاثر ولا ضد منافر. He says God did not create what he created in order to fortify his authority or for fear of the consequences of time. Sometimes you find that as human beings, we do things as a reaction to others. If you have a competitor, someone who you are competing with, could be a family member, they could be a friend, they could be a coworker, they could be your neighbor, a stranger, right? If one nation is competing with another nation, that nation, it will try to acquire more land because its competitor has lots of land. It will try to acquire more resources because its competitor or opponent has great resources. It might build its army and its arsenal because what? Because it's competing with another nation, right? So sometimes as human beings, we act in reaction to others. We are in competition with others. Either in a positive way, we are competing with one another positively, or we are competing with one another negatively. Whereas he says, God did not create what he created in order to fortify his own authority or for fear of the consequences of time or to seek help against the attack of a peer, a boastful partner, or a hateful opponent. God did not need to prove his authority. There is no one who opposes God. There is no one who competes with God. There is no one who is a peer to God. He doesn't need to compete with anyone. God does not need to do anything in reaction to others. And there are other beautiful descriptions that he gives us of God. Truly humbling descriptions of God. Truly masterful, beautiful, impeccable descriptions of God. And in many of the other sermons and the statements of Imam Ali alayhi salam, we find greater detail, very beautiful detail of how he describes to us the place of God. Sometimes he talks about God's power and might. Sometimes he talks about God's mercy and compassion and many of the other attributes of God. But Imam Ali alayhi salam was not only a masterful theologian in conceptualizing God, but he was also a profound worshipper of God. In his devotion in his relationship with God, we find that Imam Ali expresses to us and shows us what it means to have the purest form of worship to God. In a famous statement, he says, Ilahi ma abadtuka khawfan min narika wa la tama'an fi jannatik. My Lord, I worship you not out of fear of your punishment, nor out of hope for your reward. I speak about myself. Why do I worship God? Because God has promised me gardens and rivers and food and drink and mates and all of that, all of those descriptions, right? So I say, if I worship God, God's going to give me. He's going to give me the best. Or, I worship God because I fear that if I don't worship God, I'm going to be punished. And this is sometimes how we even socialize our children. If you don't pray, if you don't fast, if you don't do what's right, God's going to punish you in the hereafter. If you think back maybe on your own upbringing when you were a child, oftentimes you find that in some cultural contexts, this is how our primary conception of God is: a God who is vengeful, who is wrathful, who wants to punish, who's just waiting to punish. But oftentimes we find ourselves, we worship God either because we seek God's rewards or because we fear God's punishment. Whereas Imam Ali alayhi salam says, my Lord, I don't worship you neither because I seek the pleasures of your rewards, nor because I fear your punishment. So why, O Amir al-Mu'mineen, why do you worship God? وَلَكِنْ وَجَدْتُكَ أَهْلًا لِلْعِبَادَةِ فَعَبَدْتُ. But it is that I found only you to be suitable for worship, so I worshipped you. Because Imam Ali alayhi salam understood God. He recognized God. Imam Ali's worship of God was the purest form of worship among the Prophet's earliest companions, those who accepted Islam. None other than Ali began his life in absolute pure worship of God. Ali ibn Abi Talib never prostrated before an idol throughout his entire life. Never. Some others did. They spent 20, 30, 40 years, and then God guided them to the truth. But they spent considerable time worshipping other than God, prostrating before idols, whereas Amir al-Mu'mineen never prostrated before an idol. This is why all Muslims, even those who do not subscribe to the school of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim as-salam, when they speak about Ali, they say, Ali karramallahu wajhah. May God ennoble his face. Why? Because his face never prostrated before an idol. It's recognized. So Imam Ali's devotion to God was one that was unconditional. I found only you suitable for worship, so I worshipped you. And this is the purest form of worship. It's very much like unconditional love. If we speak about the relationship between two individuals, a spouse, a pair, man and woman, husband and wife, or we speak about, for instance, the love between parents and children. We often say that parents, their love for their children is unconditional. What does this mean? This means that as a parent, I love my child without conditions. Not based on what my child can give me or offer me, regardless. This is the purest form of love. And it is that which is most desirable. This is what we want between us as partners, right? You want your partner to love you unconditionally and vice versa. Because it is the purest form of love. It is that which we all seek. It is the most desirable. Similarly, the most desirable kind of worship, the highest level of worship to God and devotion to God, is that which is unconditional. It is the most desirable and the purest. But unconditional worship is very hard. For most of us, unconditional worship is very, very hard. And I say this about myself. Why? Because in the vast majority of cases, we find ourselves as human beings being very much attached to rewards and material and physical fulfillment. This is what we desire. It incentivizes us. It draws us forward. We think about, what is it that I can get in return for what I do? And sometimes this kind of business mindset, if you will, and this is what how Imam Ali describes some worship. He says, there is the worship of the tujjar, the merchants. And that is characterized as what? As that in which there is expectation of return. Right? Because under normal circumstances, when you engage in a business transaction, there is give and take. What's in it for me? What am I getting in return for what I'm giving? He says there is that of the tujjar. And in many cases, our worship and devotion to God is that of the merchants. As I look, I'm very much attached to what I can get in return. I'm attached very much to the physical delights and pleasures and the material gains of this world and of the hereafter. We're strongly attached. Prophet Jesus, may God's peace and blessings be upon him and upon our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says in a beautiful saying, he says, I tell you this in truth, with certainty. Anyone who is engrossed in this material world will never taste the sweetness of worship. It's kind of like being ill. If you're sick, if you're ill, right, they can bring you your favorite dish. They can bring you the sweetest dish. But when you eat it, you don't taste the food. He says those who are engrossed in this material world, meaning what? Meaning it is their primary focus. It is what they think about the most. What am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? Where am I going to go? How much money am I going to make? Where am I going to travel? When you're always thinking about that. Always. Of course, we're all in the material world. And there is nothing wrong with eating and drinking and traveling and making money and enjoying. As long as it is within God's permissible boundaries, it's fine. There's no problem. But when we are engrossed in material fulfillment and desires, it is the thing that takes up most of our attention and time and efforts. We become engrossed. Prophet Jesus, alayhi salam, he says, then you will not feel the sweetness of worship. Worship will be bland for you. If you engage in worship, it will be bland. There will be no sweetness to it. So how was Imam Ali alayhi salam able to taste the sweetness of worship unconditionally? Because he was not attached to the material world. He lived in the material world, but he was not attached to the material world. In letter number 45 of Nahj al-Balagha, this letter is written, he writes to his governor in Basra, Uthman ibn Hunayf al-Ansari. It's a long letter. And Imam Ali writes this letter in response to an incident that occurs, which he was disturbed by some of the actions of his governor of Basra. By the way, this is how Imam Ali operated. Imam Ali was not someone just to bring someone and put him in position and then let him go. Do whatever you want. If he saw good, he praised it. If he saw bad, he criticized it. Others, they came, they brought their family members and their kin, and they put them in all kinds of positions. And they chose to turn a blind eye to some of their wrongdoings. Imam Ali was not about that. It's not about that. And this made him a lot of enemies. But Imam Ali, if you recall from last night's lecture, he says one thing to keep your intellect intact is when you are not ashamed to speak the truth. And he was never ashamed to speak the truth. So he writes this letter to his governor, Uthman ibn Hunayf al-Ansari, and within it, he says to him, he says, ألا وإن لكل مأموم إماما يقتدي به ويستضيء بنور علمه. He says to him, every follower has an imam, a leader, whom he learns from and whom he acquires the light of guidance from. And then he continues. He says, ألا وإن إمامكم قد اكتفى من دنياه بطمريه ومن طعمه بقرصيه. Your leader, he's speaking about himself. He says, as for your leader has been satisfied with the material world in the following regards. That which brings satisfaction to Imam Ali out of the material world is the following, he says. He says, قَدْ اكْتَفَى مِن دُنْيَاهُ بِطِمْرَيْهِ وَمِن طُعْمِهِ بِقُرْصَيْهِ. He says, sufficient for me out of the pleasures and the delights of this world is 2 outfits, 2 pieces of clothing only, and 2 loaves of bread for my meal. That's all I need. I don't need more. I wear 1 outfit, it becomes dirty, I wear the other one, I wash the first one, and back and forth. And all I need is 2 loaves. I eat 1 in the day, 1 in the night, and that's it. That's all that is required. That's all that I need out of this material world. Was Imam Ali poor? Did he not have access to funds? Was he not the caliph who had access to the Muslim treasury? Did he not work himself? He used to work himself. He would go out and he would do all kinds of work and engage in trade and make an honorable living for himself and to provide for his family. So Imam Ali had money. But he says that what is enough out of this world for me is 2 items of clothing and 2 loaves of bread. And then he goes on to say, he reminds us, this is between parentheses, he reminds us what it means to have a zuhd. What is a zuhd? A zuhd is a concept that appears, of course, prominently in our teachings, in the Quran, in the prophetic traditions, and those of the Ahlul Bayt. A zuhd can be translated as asceticism. What is asceticism? Asceticism is usually understood as not possessing material gains, not having any material gains. So you don't own a house, you don't own a vehicle, you don't own much property or, other things. That's usually the general understanding of asceticism. Imam Ali defines for us az-zuhd. Very beautiful words. He says, az-zuhd laysa an la tamlika shay wa innama an la yamlukaka shay. He says, zuhd is not that you do not own anything, but that nothing owns you. Own a house, own property, own clothing, own food, own wealth. Own all of these things. But make sure, Imam Ali says, that none of these things own you. They don't control you. So Imam Ali teaches us what zuhd is. And then he says, he continues in his letter. He says, أَلَا وَإِنَّكُمْ لَا تَقْدِرُونَ عَلَى ذَلِكَ. But I know, my dear followers, that you are not able to emulate this lifestyle. It's hard. I know that most of you can't just live your lives with 2 articles of clothing or 2 loaves of bread. I know, I understand. ألا وإنكم لا تقدرون على ذلك ولكن, however, Imam Ali says, أعينوني بورع واجتهاد وعفة وسداد. He says, you may not be able to do as I do. However, you can still assist me by doing 4 things. What are these 4 things? He says, number 1, displaying wara, which is moral and ethical or pious precaution. Be precautious when it comes to your morals and your ethics and your piety. Don't be a risk taker. You know, being a risk taker is good for business maybe. Might be good for traveling. It's nice to be adventurous when you travel. Or be courageous and a risk taker when engaging in business, right? But there are some things where taking risks is not desirable. When it comes to my morals and my ethics, I should not be a risk taker. I should proceed on the side of caution. This is what wara is, to maintain this sense of caution. When the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, was introducing to the Muslims the beauty of the month of Ramadan, on the last Friday of the month of Sha'ban, he gave a sermon. And he discussed all of the details and the blessings of the month of Ramadan. Very beautiful sermon. After he finished, Imam Ali asked the Prophet, he said, Ya Rasulullah, what is the best action to take in the month of Ramadan? You've told us all of these great things. Tell me, what's the best thing to do during the month of Ramadan? And Imam Ali replies to him, he says, Al-wara'u an maharimillah. The best thing that you can do is maintain a sense of piety against doing anything that will displease God. Be cautious. Don't displease God. Even if you don't engage in ritual and you don't engage in all of these acts of worship, at least do not cause displeasure to God. Don't do something that you know God would not like for you to do. This is what al-wara is. So he says that engage in wara, this piety or pietistic precaution that stems from a mindfulness of God. When you keep God in your mind. When you think about how your statement or your action, how it will fare with God. Will this be something that God would be okay with? Or, God forbid, is this something that would displease God? This is the essence of al-wara. So he says, number 1, assist me by having and maintaining this sense of piety. The second, he says, wajtihad. Ijtihad is what? Is diligence. It is putting your entire effort in whatever you may do. Imam Ali alayhi salam encourages us not to be lazy in anything that we do. If it comes to my education, that I put my entire effort in my education. If it comes to my work, then I put my entire effort in my work. When it comes to my relationships, I put my entire effort in my relationships. Anything that I engage in, anything that I embark on, any project, not to do it halfway or without effort, but to put your entire effort in that act. And we have many traditions that tell us that sometimes the best of acts, they are not necessarily considered in terms of their size. It's the quality that counts. And so some ahadith, they tell us that the best act is that which is done sincerely and completely. Not halfway. Don't engage in any activity, be it a relationship with someone, or when it comes to your studies, or your work, or project, or whatever it may be, halfway. Put your entire effort. Imam Ali wants us to be diligent in our actions. So number 2 is ijtihad. Number 3, iffa, which is moderation. Iffa is moderation when it comes to those things that we consume. when it comes to the food and the drink that we consume. Maintain moderation. And this is a principle that the Quran gives us. God says, "Kulu washrabu wa la tusrifu." Eat and drink, but do not be wasteful. Sometimes we find that we are truly wasteful when it comes to our consumption. Right? If you look at the average American or Canadian, how much food do we waste? You go to the store, right? And especially if it's the afternoon in the month of Ramadan, you want to buy everything, right? You're hungry? You want to buy everything. You go to Costco and you just add. Now it's okay if you consume that food. If your family consumes it, it's fine. But how much of it goes to waste? How many? Billions of pounds of food goes to waste every year. Gets thrown in the trash. When it comes to the spending of our money, we should maintain moderation. Not to be frugal. We're encouraged to be generous, not to be frugal, but not to be wasteful as well. And this is very, very important. It's a challenge, brothers and sisters, living in a very material world. You see thousands of advertisements every single day. Some you don't even recognize. And those are the best kind of advertisements, those that are very subconscious. And now with social media and the algorithms, nowadays it's really scary. Sometimes you're having a conversation with your spouse about something, and then you open Facebook, and suddenly an ad appears about that very thing. It's weird. You're like, I don't know, is my phone listening to me? Right? That's how it works. Pushes us to buy more and more and more and more, never to be satisfied with what we have. To the point where sometimes it becomes extravagant. Imam Ali tells us, maintain moderation when it comes to your spending, when it comes to your food. Eat and drink. If you have leftovers, you've invited people, be generous with them. If you have leftovers, give them to those who are in need. Don't throw it away. Don't be wasteful. How many people live in the world who cannot even imagine the food that we have, brothers and sisters? They can't even imagine the kind of food that we eat. This is very important for us. Imam Ali says, I know that you cannot survive on 2 loaves of bread, but maintain moderation. Right? Iffah, when it comes to our interactions, have moderation in how you interact with people, when you speak to people. Ensure that you are pleasant, that you don't say anything harmful or abusive to others. Even if they make you angry, even if they upset you, be moderate. If someone attacks you, the Quran says, وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. When those who are ignorant, they speak to you, they address you, the response is what? Salam. Salam. This is part of the moderation that we are expected and encouraged to uphold. And number 4, he says, وَسَدَادٍ. Sadad is overall success, integrity. Imam Ali encourages us to be truthful, to live lives of integrity, where the internal and the external, there is no divergence. What is within my heart and mind and my outer being and expressions, they come together. There are no gaps between my private and public. Live with integrity, right? So he says, I know you cannot have this kind of relation to the material world, but you can assist me. There are some things that you can do. And so what we find in Imam Ali alayhi salam is a profound understanding of God. One that goes beyond just surface level recognition of God. We find a profound devotion to God and connection to God. He spent his entire life, from the moment of his birth until his death, every waking moment in devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at what Imam Ali alayhi salam, he gives us in terms of his spiritual legacy, the legacy of the du'as that he has given us. We recited Dua Kumail earlier. Look at the beautiful words of Dua Kumail. How Imam Ali speaks to God. How he turns to God. How he implores God. He invokes God. My Lord. إلهي وسيدي ومولاي من لي غيرك أسأله كشف ضري. My Lord, who do I have other than you to bring me relief? يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غنى ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء وسلاحه البكاء يا سابغ النعم يا دافع النقم. The words that Imam Ali chooses, he teaches you and me, he teaches us how to perceive of God. Look at the beauty of Dua al-Sabah, brothers and sisters. Dua al-Sabah also is related by Imam Ali, recommended to recite every morning. A profound dua. And you know, if you make it a habit, brothers and sisters, if you make it a habit, Dua Kumail, of course, it's recommended to recite Thursday nights, but it's always recommended to recite. You don't have to wait until Thursday to recite. You recite it at any time. Anytime you want to speak to God, anytime you feel that you need a closer connection, use the words of the Imams. They taught us. They're there. No other community, even if you look at other communities, they have excellent traditions of du'as and of psalms and everything. But with all due respect, I don't think there's any comparison. Look at the words of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Look at his beautiful words in Munajat Amir al-Mu'mineen. Mawlaya ya Mawlaya. أنت الغني وأنا الفقير. وهل يرحم الفقير إلا الغني. My Lord, you are the wealthy and I am the poor. And who will have mercy upon the poor except the wealthy? مولاي يا مولاي أنت المالك وأنا المملوك. You are the master and owner, and I am the one who is owned. I am the slave. And who will have mercy upon the slave except the master? مولاي يا مولاي أنت الكبير وأنا الصغير. You are the grand, the mighty, and I am the small. And who will have mercy upon the small except the grand? Very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. It penetrates the depth of our soul if we really take the time to recite these prayers, to recite these supplications, to become very familiar with them, to use them. Imam Ali teaches us, he gifts us this very beautiful gift. There can be no better gift than this gift that the Imam left for us. And many others, many du'as. Imam Ali teaches us what it means to recognize God, to devote God, to turn our attention to God. In one short dua, which is narrated by Abu Darda. Abu Darda was a companion of the Imam. He relates this. He says, one day, I was searching for Amir al-Mu'mineen in the evening. So he goes to his home. Imam Ali is not in his home. He goes to the market. He goes around. He's searching for Imam Ali at night. Sometimes Imam Ali would seclude himself. He would isolate himself and he would turn his entire attention and focus to God. Some alone time just between him and God. So he says, as I was searching, as I was walking, late in the evening, suddenly I heard a very sad sound and voice coming. He says, I approached closer and I recognized that it was the voice of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, I went closer, I saw Imam Ali sitting next to a tree at night. He raised his hands to the sky and he was weeping and crying. And he was imploring God. And he says, I heard him recite the following dua. He says, I heard him say, Ilahi وكم من موبقة حلمت عن مقابلتها بنقمتك. He says, my Lord, how many distressful situations in which I did wrong, when I've committed wrong, how many times in the face of my committing these acts, these wrong acts, have you returned me with your mercy and compassion, your clemency? I did wrong, but instead of treating me with your wrath and your punishment, you treated me with your mercy. You were clement towards me. إلهي كم من موبقة حلمت عن مقابلتها بنقمتك وكم من جريرة تكرمت عن كشفها بكرمك. My Lord, how many wrongdoings that I engaged in secrecy. No one else knew. I did a wrongdoing in secrecy. Yet, my Lord, through your kindness, you did not expose me. You concealed my faults. Only you know about them. You did not allow anyone else to know about them, even those closest to me. إلهي إن طال في عصيانك عمري وعظم في الصحف ذنبي. My Lord, if my disobedience to you has been great, and my book of records has increased with wrongdoing, if I've spent many years in your disobedience, فما أنا بمؤمل غير غفرانك ولا أنا براج غير رضوانك. Yet still, my Lord, I will continue to have hope in your mercy and compassion. I'll still turn to you, my Lord, because I know that you will be merciful to me. I know that you will forgive me. I know you will express compassion towards me. It's very beautiful words. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he teaches us. He teaches us how to conceive of God, how to speak to God, how to interact with God. This is a major lesson that we learn from Imam Ali. Imam Ali teaches us what it means to have that sense of devotion and spirituality. And this lesson is especially important for us on a night like this night. Laylatul Qadr. إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر وما أدراك ما ليلة القدر. God says, we revealed the Quran on Laylatul Qadr. And do you know the value of Laylatul Qadr? God is asking us. وما أدراك ما ليلة القدر. ليلة القدر خير من ألف شهر. The night of Qadr is greater than 1,000 months. 1,000 months translates into a whole lifetime, 83 plus years. God says on this night, single night, is more valuable with God and more important with God than an entire lifetime, 1,000 months. It is the night which God chose to reveal the Quran, and it is also the night that many reports, they tell us, this is the night in which God signs off on our needs, our hajat, our fates, our decrees on this night. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has privileged us. He has given us another chance. We're all sitting here tonight, brothers and sisters. Allah has invited us. He has given us this chance to witness and to experience Laylatul Qadr. Tonight is a night where we try to refocus our efforts on God once again. If I've drifted away from God, tonight I return to God. I spend some time. I contemplate, I reflect tonight. I turn to God in seeking forgiveness. I turn to God in prayer and devotion, in recitation of the Quran. Tonight is an important night, brothers and sisters. Let's spend at least a little bit of time. Everyone is always busy. Everyone always has things to do. Our work does not finish. Our meetings do not finish. Our affairs in this life do not finish. But our time to build our hearts and our minds, our souls, is very limited. So let's spend tonight turning to God. When you stand before God tonight, speak to God in that language that you know. See how the Imams, they teach us to speak to God very intimately. It's as though you are speaking to a beloved partner, someone who's very close to you. Speak to God in that language that you know. Say, my Lord, you know me better than I know myself. You know my weaknesses. You know my faults. You know my wrongdoing. You know my preoccupations. My Lord, I have hope in your mercy. I will never despair in your mercy. I need your mercy and I need your forgiveness. My Lord, I need you to guide me to that which is good. My Lord, do not leave me to my own devices. Don't leave me alone. Hold my hand. Guide me to that which is good. Put me in the right places. Connect me with the right people. So tonight is a night in which we spend a little bit of time with God, in addition to performing some of the recommended acts. A 2 rak'ah prayer, the dua of the Quran, the recitation of the Quran, dua al-Jawshan al-Kabir, such a beautiful dua. Dua al-Jawshan al-Kabir is also another profound description of God with all of God's attributes, where we turn to God and we seek God's mercy and compassion. And tonight is a night that we should also not forget our brothers and sisters. Those who are ill, those who are sick, those who have hajat. Everyone has hajat. Turn to Allah and ask Allah for the sake of this blessed night to grant their hajat, to bring relief and comfort to those who are suffering, and to grant your hajat, to give you and your family members health of body, health of mind, health of spirit, to grant us all success and wealth, to grant us goodness in this life and in the hereafter. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us on this night, to forgive our shortcomings, our misdeeds, to instill His love and recognition and devotion in our hearts, to allow us to continue to raise our children and our families and ourselves in a way that is pleasing to God. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring relief and comfort to those who are sick, those who are ill, those who are living under oppression and injustice around the world. We ask Allah to honor us with the ziyarah of Muhammad wa al-Muhammad in this life and their shafa'ah in the hereafter. We ask Allah to hasten the reappearance of our 12th Imam al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Mahdi, and to bless the souls of all of the marhumeen. For all of their souls, let us recite Surah Al-Fatiha, ma'a salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.